Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal. I'm the host of Living History, and in today's program we're going to carry on discussing COVID-19 and the history of pandemics. This is the second part of the program. Listeners may recall that in the first part we covered the broad origins of viruses and some of the historical pandemics that we've seen in the planet. In this second part, I'm going to focus with my expert panelists, Amjad, Hussain and Arif Ahmad. Amjad and Arif, welcome again. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So just to sort of recap, as I said in the previous program, where we looked at virology, history of viruses and pandemics, we covered the origins from really early times, around 2 billion years ago, up to the 20th century, which hopefully for the listeners will have laid the groundwork for this important program, because I think almost everybody is familiar with COVID and its impact on our lives. In this episode, we will mainly focus on the 20th and 21st century viruses such as SARS, names you'll have heard on the news, no doubt, and we'll go into a lot more detail in this program, MERS and coronavirus 2 that causes COVID-19. It is a pressing subject, I'm sure you'll agree, and just to sort of recap before I get Arif and Amjad really to open up, to remind listeners that we all live and prosper and thrive in a cloud of viruses, and our species as humankind have been doing so for the past hundreds and thousands of years. Viruses infect all living things on the planet. That includes plants, trees, birds, fish, you name it, they infect them. Knowingly and unknowingly, we eat and breathe billions of virus particles each day. Approximately 380 trillion virus particles live in and around our bodies. In the last program, we also mentioned that 8.3% of our genome is made up of remnants of retrovirus infections that happened to our ancestors long before we were Homo sapiens. These have been passed on to us from our ancient ancestors and are now part of our DNA. Majority of these viruses pass through without causing too much harm, but some are extremely harmful in the way they are transmitted and the impact they have on our lives. In the first few minutes of this program, we are going to deal with the emergence of these viruses and explore various factors that contribute to their rapid spread around the world at alarming rates. Viruses are not new phenomena. Humans have been battling viruses before our species had even evolved into Homo sapiens. So every human virus that we today had a non-human source. So Amjad, I'm going to ask you to really take us through some viruses are clearly now familiar as human viruses. We've lived with them for many hundreds of years. But a lot of viruses have animal origins, what we call zoonotic viruses. Just take us through these viruses and SARS, COVID, coronavirus 2 in particular.
Well, Dr. Iqbal said the SARS-CoV-2 was a zoonotic virus to begin with, like you rightly said, that it came from non-human animals and transmitted to humans. It is a cross-species infection, also called a spillover. Obviously, it is no longer a zoonotic virus. It is now classified as a human virus, as it is rapidly spreading from humans to humans, with millions now infected worldwide. Many viruses in the past have jumped this way from animals to humans. To emphasize this point, let me just tell our listeners a little bit about the simian immunodeficiency virus, SIV. This virus
Simian relates to monkeys?
Monkeys, yes, indeed.
Yes.
It is transmitted, this virus mainly infects primates, like you said, such as apes and monkeys. It is transmitted through contact with infected body fluids, such as blood. It is widespread among non-human primates, and in most species, it does not appear to cause severe illness. Studies have shown similarities between the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, and simian immunodeficiency virus. SIV, it is thought to have jumped to humans by the practice of butchering chimpanzees and other primates for meat consumption in West African countries such as Liberia, the Republic of the Congo, and the Ivory Coast. The consumption of monkey meat is also common in some Asian countries such as China, Cambodia, and in some parts of India and Indonesia. This obviously increases the chance for viral transmission. Scientists suspect that once SIV was in humans, it evolved into a HIV through random mutation. The initial transmission of the virus is thought to have come from chimpanzees, and it has occurred in Africa between 1884 and 1924. HIV obviously is a retrovirus that attacks and gradually destroys the immune system. This leaves the person unprotected against infections. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, known as AIDS, is the final stage of a HIV infection. According to World Health Organization figures last year, for instance, in 2019, it is thought to have, that's the HIV, is thought to have infected over 37.5 million people worldwide, and are now basically infected with HIV.
They're pretty nasty things, obviously, viruses, but humans have contributed to this as well. I think it's important to understand the factors that are the underlying causes of these viral infections. And there are several underlying ecological and anthropogenic activities that promote these viruses. Arif, perhaps you could take us some of the things that humankind themselves have introduced and why we're getting much more infections.
Well, obviously, Dr. Sab, one thing which has obviously contributed is the growth of human population. So if we look at the rapid growth in the last 500 years, now today there's about 7.8 million people. Billion people, on the earth, whereas 500 years ago it was 500 million. So that's a 14-fold increase, which is, astonishing. And even I looked up something that even the population has doubled from 4 billion to nearly 8 billion since 1974. So these massive growth, especially in the urban areas, it's like a magnet for viruses. The human population inhabits virtually every corner of this planet, and these changes to the ecosystem, they're on a gargantuan industrial scale, which has never been seen or never envisaged before in our history. If you add in climate change, which now, depending on your point of view, there's obviously it's a fact. There's destruction of the rainforest that's happening before our eyes. That's undeniable, and this has meant that we're introducing countless pollutants, toxins, and carcinogenic substances into the air, land, and sea. If you just look at the example of plastics, they were never seen in the ecosystem before. Now there are millions of tons entering into the ecosystem. And this is altering ecology at a rapid pace. Again, if we look at how the Earth has changed, scientists have recently estimated that more than half, approximately 55% of trees, have disappeared since humans started cutting them down. This deforestation is happening at accelerated rates, and the zoonotic jumps often happen at the edges of the world's tropical forests. So where deforestation is happening or increasing, it's bringing people into contact with animals' natural habitats. And biologists who have studied these zoonoses, they say that diseases such as yellow fever, malaria, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, and Ebola, all of these have spilled over from one species to another at the margins of the forest. Just to give an example, the Indonesian rainforest, the size of England, was burnt down in 1997 just to make way for agriculture and farming. The whole forest in the area was eventually engulfed in smoke and smothered in haze, and as a result the trees could not produce fruit, leaving the resident fruit bats, with no option but to fly elsewhere in search of food, and obviously with them they were carrying deadly diseases. Soon after these bats settled in trees in nearby orchards, the pigs and other domesticated animals around them started to fall sick. And this was presumably caused by them eating fallen fruits that the bats had nibbled on. And also local farmers, they also fell ill. So by 1999, over 265 people had developed brain inflammation, and 105 of these had died. This was the first known emergence of the Nipah virus in people. And since the year 2000, stings of recent outbreaks of Nipah have happened across Southeast Asia, and these have been widely reported.
I'm going to turn to Amjad now. I mean, obviously, there are viruses like the Zika virus, which were in the news many, many years ago, and others. But there are, Amjad, the other man-made activities. Perhaps you could cover some of those as well. Obviously, deforestation has been a prominent feature.
Well, Zika was also reported last year, for instance, in Brazil. Yes, of course, there are many other human activities that also increase our abilities to become infected with viruses that were not with us before, such as dams, water reservoirs, canals, and other impoundments of irrigation and recreation purposes. These provide new environment for virus vectors to thrive and multiply. The recent outbreak, for instance, of dengue virus in a number of countries in Southeast and South Asia is a good example of this. For instance, Pakistan and India, the dengue virus, in addition to the COVID pandemic, is a serious issue. So dengue basically is a mosquito-borne viral infection. It is found in tropical and subtropical climates, and mostly in urban and semi-urban areas, and really thrives well in pools of water impoundments. The global incidence of dengue has grown dramatically in recent decades, and there is estimates to be 100 to 400 million infections each year. About half of the world population is now at risk. And for instance, only last year, because of climate change and global warming, dengue has been reported as far north as France, actually. And also another thing that is contributing to these viruses is rerouting of wildlife and immigration patterns of these wildlife. Another factor is wildlife parks also increase our exposure to potentially new viruses, long-distance transport of livestock, and obviously taking exotic birds and animals as pets. Remember, these exotic pets also come with their own exotic viruses.
Yeah, and there's, of course, with the hospitalization and medical, Amjad, but just take us a little bit about, blood transfusions and stuff as well, because these are contributing as well, aren't they?
Absolutely. Then there are, Dr. Saab, you rightly mentioned, many viruses that can actually be transmitted through blood transfusion, such as HIV, hepatitis, West Nile virus, cytomegalovirus, human T-cell lipotropic virus, and parvovirus B19. Some of these viruses can also easily be transmitted through drug abuse, sharing of needles and syringes, for instance, as well as sexual activities. Another recent innovation, believe it or not, are daycare centers. There are many kids together in proximity. They can pass on and share viruses and then bring them home to their parents, grandparents, and extended families.
And I think it's worthwhile making a good point there. So in the recent, obviously the coronavirus crisis which is happening, daycare centres were one of the last places to open up. I think a lot of parents have been crying out for these places to be opened up, but because they create that environment where young children are maybe spreading saliva and these sorts of things, it shows that it seems very innocuous, but it's a breeding ground for viruses. And if we look further beyond that, things like package holidays and air travel and excursions, people like to go further afield. They like to go to more exotic and remote locations. They like to go on safaris. These are also now a major source of the globalization of viruses. Even simple things like hot tubs and swimming pools, if they're not properly sanitized and disinfected with chlorine or bromine, and recreational water activities, they're also a means of spreading pathogen around the human population. And even something simple like air conditioning, that can also help to spread viruses. Even something like vehicle tires. We see lots and lots of vehicle tires stacked up around the world. They actually hold moisture, and they are actually breathing grounds for pathogens. So you can see there's a whole spectrum of where viruses can grow and where they can be passed on to humans.
Oh, they spread at an astonishing speed, and we've seen that in the current crisis. These days, compare with our ancestors who lived in small communities of 200 or 300 people or so. We've got thousands and thousands and millions of people crowded on the sort of urban centres. And you mentioned air travel, Arif, earlier on. Now in the 21st century, just to illustrate your point, you can go to a website such as Flight Radar 24 air24.com that tracks airborne commercial flights, and we're astonished to see literally thousands of aircraft that are airborne around the world at any given time. And then you tie that up with rail travel, with car travel and everything. The spread is just quite amazing, as we've seen, and then the steps that are taken. So this now really brings us towards the coronavirus that's making the headlines at the moment. Just to firstly describe the coronavirus first, and then Amjad's our scientific expert, so he's going to explain a little bit more about coronaviruses. But the coronaviruses have spiky projections on their surface. I think everybody's seen their pictures in the medium. And they look similar to crowns or halo when viewed under the scanning electron microscope. These are named corona because in Latin corona means crown. So the virus particle size is very small indeed. It measures around 100 nanometers, which is very, very, very small, and only to be able to display it using the electron microscope. Human coronaviruses were first identified in the mid-1960s, and now there are 4 main subgroupings of coronaviruses known as alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. So Amjad, perhaps if you could take us through, but don't lose us too much in the science, though, we warn you. Go on.
No, well, Dr. Sahab, I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. There are 7 human coronaviruses that have been identified so far, like you rightly mentioned, in the alpha, the beta coronavirus genera. Of these, the 4 circulating strains in the human population are human coronavirus NLC6.
They have all these numbers in front of them, but I'm going to let you don't have to call the numbers out.
All right, fine. But just basically, these 4 are responsible for 20% of the causes of common cold in people. The more recent addition to the list of coronaviruses are SARS, MERS, and CoV-2. These are thought to have common ancestors in the population and have jumped species through an intermediate host. There are also gamma and delta coronaviruses. They seem to have originated from birds. For SARS-CoV,
so I think do you remember the bird flu business and all that?
That is basically yes.
Okay, yeah.
So basically, the gamma and the delta species of the coronaviruses, they have originated from birds. The SARS CoV-1, as it's called, is thought to have the intermediate host in civet cats, and MERS-CoV is the intermediate host for that is the dromedary camels, and the viruses jump from bats. Most likelihood is that either the bats biting these animals or these animals were exposed somewhat to the bat droppings. The virus is basically jumped through this intermediate, it is thought. So once in the intermediate host, the virus underwent some order of replication, and in doing so, it acquired mutations that allowed the virus to be easily transmitted to the human population. And the whole virus does is, it basically binds to it steals lipids. Lipids is a fancy word for fats. It's basically steal some of the material, protein material from the intermediate host, and then basically we humans have similar, because we consume these animal meats, we become also susceptible to these viruses. So for transmission purposes, it is understood that people who are connected with animal husbandry, such as those involved in the breeding and looking after these camels, got infected initially, then subsequently passed on the virus to the rest of the human population.
In the old days, we used to be frightened of watching Dracula movies and seeing bats, but this is actually much more frightening than all those horror movies. But clearly, from what we're seeing is that the bat coronaviruses are considerably undersampled in less studies, and they pose a major, major danger to human beings at the moment. The issue or the fact that a vast reservoir of unknown potentially lethal viruses out there in bats could infect humans needs a lot more study, because the effects, as we've seen, can be quite devastating. I don't think we want to forecast doom and gloom. It is with regret to assume the current pandemic is unfortunately not the last strain of coronavirus that we are going to encounter in the human population. Just by looking at the last 3 zoonotic jumps of highly pathogenic coronaviruses, you mentioned SARS, Amjad, COVID-1, MERS, and SARS-CoV-2, which is COVID-19 now, that have now crossed the species barrier into the human population in recent memory. So this pandemic, unfortunately, is going to last. This is probably a good stage now to move on specifically to COVID-19 and the origin of the SARS-CoV-2. So probably, Amjad, you're best placed again as our scientific. Arif, I'll come to you in a little while. Just explain what SARS means. It's to do with respiratory syndrome, but go on.
Well, there have actually been 2 SARS viruses now. So we're dealing with the initial SARS outbreak. So basically, SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, also known as SARS-CoV or SARS-CoV-1. Is basically rapidly fatal infectious viral disease. It is a strain of virus that causes, of course, a severe acute respiratory syndrome. It is enveloped, positive sense, single-stranded RNA virus which infects the epithelial cells within the lungs. The virus enters the host cell by binding to angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin converting enzyme is called ACE2 by scientists, and that's what it stands for, angiotensin converting enzyme. It is basically an enzyme attached to the cell membranes of the cells in our lungs, in our arteries, heart, kidneys, and intestines. So basically, this is where the virus actually binds. So SARS-CoV-1 was recognized as a global threat back in 2003. The viral disease first appeared in southern China in November of 2002 and spread to more than 24 countries in Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. There have not been any serious new cases of SARS since 2004, and the risk is relatively low. And one of the reasons is that why the SARS-1 did not rapidly spread, because we soon identified where it came from, and that was the civet cat. So basically, by doing the cull of civet cats, we eliminated the intermediate host, which was the vector for introducing this virus. Unfortunately, now with this new virus, we don't understand what is the intermediate vector. Is it the pangolin, is it the bat, or is it some other unknown animal that as yet remains unidentified?
So what actually causes the SARS? Arif, maybe you could again in a layman's language take us through.
Although it's the virus causes illness, coronaviruses, they commonly cause mild to moderate upper respiratory illnesses in humans, but they can also cause respiratory, gastrointestinal, liver, and other neurological diseases in animals. Obviously, research is ongoing. But researchers, they quickly...
I think just to add here, because even when we talk about respiratory syndromes, etc., my PhD was in pulmonary fibrosis. We're looking at poor rat lungs. And when you look at an acute damage inflammatory response in a lung, it is terrible. The lungs basically just get clogged up with all sorts of cells and damage and whatever, and you just cannot breathe. And it's a very nasty way of dying. So I know when we mention it SARS, and it sounds like an acute illness, but it is a very nasty way of dying.
Sorry to interject, Arif Sab. Basically, what happens is when you get this is basically what causes pneumonia. Pneumonia. So basically, what happens to pneumonia? Basically, because of reactions that lungs, the mucus basically builds up. So you got the lots of fluid building up in your lungs, and you drown in those basically fluid. Yeah. And unfortunately, the only medical intervention you can have is give you oxygen.
Ventilators and stuff. Sorry, Arif, to interject, but I just thought I'd mention I've seen the lungs of poor mice, and not humans, but I think the human lung looks exactly the same if under the microscope as well.
Very
but
useful
carry on
to set,
about the research and
to set the tone for what actually happens. So researchers have they're trying to find a bit more about the characteristics of SARS-CoV, because they're obviously not something they'd identified before. And while they may not have confirmed the disease origins, as Amjad Sab said, many of them believed it first occurred in animals such as bats and through an intermediate host, civet cat, and then eventually to humans. So this is important that once it spreads to humans, so for example in children and in adults, the virus incubation period from exposure to infection is 2 to 7 days, although the infection has taken as long as 10 days in some cases. However, this is very important to remember. Not everyone who's exposed to the disease becomes ill. And scientists from around the world are collaborating to gain a better understanding of the causes of SARS.
I think this is probably a good place to stop for the first part of the program. In the second part, we will look at what are the signs and symptoms of this terrible disease and a lot more about the impact of COVID-19 on our lives and on our planet. You've been listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program. This was the second part of the COVID-19 program and pandemics. Please go on to the Voice of Islam website, www.voiceofislam.co.uk, to listen to the many other programs on history that we've done. I think nearly 30 now, Arif and Amjad. So we've had a very good contribution, I think, to the Voice of Islam. And do give us your feedback at VI Living History, please, and we would love to hear your views. We will see you shortly. Welcome back to part 2 of our program on COVID-19 and the history of pandemics. In the first part, we talked about what is SARS, the acute respiratory syndrome, and the origins of coronavirus, etc., and the spread from animals. In this section, I want to concentrate a little bit more on the medical aspects and really the impacts of the pandemic. Amjad, if you could just take us through briefly on some of the symptoms that you see. We described in part 1 how nasty it is as an acute respiratory syndrome, but just take us through some of the symptoms.
Well, SARS-CoV-1 may be suspected in a patient who has, for instance, any of the symptoms such as fever. So fever, anything that is above 38 degrees or 100 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. Or the patient has a history of or a contact, sexual or casual, with someone who's been diagnosed with SARS within the last 10 days, or they have travelled to a region, part of the world that World Health Organizations and government authorities have declared as a source of transmission for SARS. And for a case to be considered probable, a chest X-ray must be indicative of a typical pneumonia or acute respiratory disease syndrome. World Health Organization has added a category of a laboratory confirmed SARS, meaning that patient who would otherwise be considered probable and have tested positive for SARS based on or approved by one of these tests is called the ELISA test, and immunofluorescence of PCR. So in addition to X-rays, you need some of those things, some additional assays to be carried out by pathology to confirm whether it's definitively SARS or not. And the appearance of SARS-CoV in a chest X-ray is not always uniform, but generally appears as an abnormality with patchy inflates. SARS can be difficult to recognize in children because it mimics other respiratory diseases such as influenza. However, both in children and adults, it generally begins, with a fever. So anybody with a fever scan or a thermometer measures anything above 38 degrees and progresses to include one or more of the following symptoms, such as headache, overall feeling of discomfort, body aches and chills, sore throat, cough, pneumonia, difficulty of breathing, shortness of breath, hypoxia, that's inefficient oxygen in blood. So obviously when they do blood saturation test, you can put this probe on your finger and that just measures, it's just something that your GP carries or the nurse will carry, and they will immediately know once putting this little probe on your fingers that, what's the saturation of oxygen in your blood. Diarrhea can also be one of the symptoms for 10 to 10% of the patients. There is currently, unfortunately, no test to diagnose SARS definitively. The symptoms of SARS may look like other medical conditions such as pneumonia and other respiratory diseases. So it's an ongoing research, and that's actually, we're talking about SARS-1 here, not the COVID-19.
Amjad mentioned briefly about the spread of SARS, but Arif, perhaps you could take us through as well some of the other issues associated with its spread, because that's the crucial thing, isn't it? How rapidly and how far it spreads.
Of course, Dr. Sapin. We've all become sort of little experts in the last few months with what's been going on. So a lot of this, hopefully, people will feel familiar with. But in essence, SARS-CoV spreads from one person to another person, mainly through close contact with someone who is already infected with SARS. When a person with SARS coughs or sneezes without covering their mouth, respiratory droplets containing the living virus, they can spray up to 3 feet, and they can invade the mucous membranes of another person. So this is the reason why, obviously, wearing masks is one of the ways of preventing it from happening. However, if you're in close contact with someone with SARS, you're more at risk. And that means that if you live or work with someone with SARS, or you have direct contact with a person through kissing or hugging or sharing eating utensils, then obviously you're increasing your risk of catching SARS. Interestingly, the virus can also spread when you touch an object with infectious droplets on it and then touch your mouth, your nose, or your eyes. And you probably remember early on in the pandemic that they were encouraging people not to touch those areas, because that's one of the areas or one of the ways of spreading it. It's not known whether SARS can spread more broadly through the air, although a study in China recently indicates that there is a potential of it spreading through air conditioning systems. Research also suggests that people with SARS are infectious only when they are having symptoms such as a fever or a cough, and they are most infectious during their second week of their illness. So as a precaution, the World Health Organization recommends that people with SARS stay in isolation, either at home or in the hospital, to prevent others from getting sick. So they should stay at home, typically for 10 days until after their symptoms have gone away. Now, there's a big issue about children going back to school at the moment, but lots of children have been exposed to SARS, but many of them have not become ill or are not going to become ill. So in 2003, health authorities in Europe and North America recommended that exposed children have their temperature and health status monitored for 10 days. In addition, they were asked to follow careful precautions to prevent the virus from spreading, such as staying at home, washing their hands frequently, covering the mouth and the nose when coughing or sneezing, and contacting a healthcare provider should the symptoms appear. So these are all very basic health precautions that to prevent SARS from spreading.
The area of with the SARS or COVID-19 can be treated as been quite controversial recently, especially with President Trump jumping in with his views. The reality is, at the moment, there is no specific drug to be able to treat SARS-CoV-2, even though that they sort of talk about the anti-malarial drug, etc. And even that depends when you give it at early stages, etc. So until a drug is developed, we don't really know, and until enough is known about the science how to develop that, I think there's lots of controversy and questions about that. Prevention is usually the best thing when it comes to viruses, and their vaccines have played a big part, which we talked about in the first part, and that's a big talk at the moment as well. Currently, there is no vaccine available for SARS, but Amjad, perhaps you could just take us through some of the challenges and some of the possible good news that could be our way, but...
Yes, certainly, Dr. Saab. Research throughout the world is currently underway to develop an effective antiviral or a vaccine for the drugs for SARS-1 as well as SARS-2. Until then, unfortunately, people with SARS may receive mainly supportive therapy with oxygen and fluids to help ease symptoms, and antibiotics to help prevent or treat secondary infections. Unfortunately, antibiotics do not, however, kill SARS virus itself. That must be understood. And currently, there is no vaccine available to prevent SARS. Although immunologist Dr. Anthony Fauci, who everybody knows is the current director of the U.S. National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the United States, he is one of the leading members of the Trump administration's White House coronavirus task force, mentioned that the Center for Controlled Disease and Prevention in the United States has developed one vaccine for SARS-1, actually, not SARS-CoV-19, SARS-1, and that basically he placed this vaccine in the U.S. national stockpile. That vaccine, however, is a prototype and needs to undergo clinical trials. Therefore, clinical isolation and quarantine remains the most effective means at the moment to prevent the spread of SARS. Who recommends taking the following steps to prevent SARS? And they should include, obviously, my esteemed colleague Arif already mentioned, washing hands regularly with warm water and soap, avoid touching eyes, nose and mouth, use disposable tissues instead of hands to cover the mouth when coughing, and throw away those tissues immediately after use. So basically, single-use tissues is a very sensible thing. And also, just following, all sensible, reasonable citizens should follow public health guidance recommendations if they are in the area of pandemic. So experts from governments, their local governments, and who obviously they have the information, and they will relay on rapid diagnostic of SARS to prevent it from spreading and infecting additional people. Worldwide advisories help identify individuals at risk of developing SARS because of exposure to ill people. So during the 2003 SARS outbreak, for instance, quarantine was used as a public health measure to avoid the spread of the SARS.
So Arif, when we look at spread of the disease COVID-19, the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 as we call it, just take us through the different phases, because we got the initial news last year in December, early January, and so much has happened since then. But just take us through the different phases, because people lose track of...
Yeah, well, it seems like an eternity ago, but it's actually only 9 months ago. So as you mentioned, in December of last year, December 2019, there was a cluster of pneumonia cases of an unknown pathogen that caused the acute respiratory disease, as we talked about. And that was linked to Hunnan's seafood wholesale market in Wuhan city. That's in the Hubei province of China. And this is where...
fairly central China, isn't it?
Central China, yes, absolutely. There was over 100 wet animals that were on sale before the outbreak. So local health officials, they issued an epidemiological alert to the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and also to the World Health Organization's China office. Moving on to January of this year, January 2020, the unknown agent of the pneumonia cases was found to be a coronavirus. So on the 12th of January 2020, the World Health Organization, they gave this, initially named it novel coronavirus 2019 nCoV. And on the 11th of February 2020, they officially named this as a coronavirus disease, or COVID-19. As we've discussed, the symptoms are very similar. COVID-19 symptoms include fever, cough, sore throat, fatigue, malaise, breathlessness, and it can lead to pneumonia and acute respiratory distress syndrome, and eventually multi-organ dysfunction, because as you described, once you are not able to breathe, it affects the rest of the body. So up to June of this year, 23rd of June, COVID has basically spread throughout the world. But the highest number of cases have been seen in the Americas, followed by Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Western Pacific. However, as we all know, these figures are being updated every day, and they're only going upwards, and probably they're being underreported as well. Now, it's thought that the consumption of wild animals or direct contact with intermediate host animals was suspected to be an initial mode of transmission. However, source transmission routes of severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, they remain obscure, and at this stage they're still being investigated. And the mystery of the intermediate host, once that's found, that will also provide support to prevent further spread and in order to develop the targeted vaccine and antiviral drugs.
Yeah, but I remember the discussion going about finding, patient zero, or who was the very first patient that started, and there is still uncertainty about that. And I know internationally fingers are being pointed at different players, but one day I suppose we will find out exactly where it started from, or how it started as well. Amjad, maybe we could move a little bit specifically to COVID-19, the infection and transmission. I know we've talked in broad terms about viruses before, but some of it we've touched on early on, but just take us through some of that.
Well, basically, it's a different strain to the CoV-1, so that's why they call it CoV-2, and they reckon it obviously has genetic and zoonotic ancestry in the bat population, and the human-to-human transmission of CoV was confirmed as early as 20th of January 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, basically. So the transmission was initially assumed to occur primarily through respiratory droplets from coughs and sneezes with ranges from 1.8 to 2 meters. Subsequently, laser scattering experiments suggest speaking can also be additional mode of transmission. So initially it was just thought coughs and sneezes causes it. Now, when you're speaking in the face of another person, you're also transmitting and you're passing on droplets. Other studies have suggested that virus can be airborne for longer periods as well. Indirect contact via contaminated surface is another possible cause of infection. Research indicates that virus may remain viable on plastics and stainless steel for up to 3 days, but does not survive on cardboards, however, for more than a day or two. On copper for more than 4 hours. The virus is inactivated by soap, which destabilizes its lipid bilayer. And viral RNA has also been found in stool samples and semen from infected individuals. Initially, there were disagreements about the degree to which the virus is infectious during the incubation period was uncertain.
Created a lot of confusion, I remember early on, whether it was going to be a pandemic or not, whether it was as infectious as that. But that's an interesting point. Go on.
Well, so basically on the 1st of, initially there was some confusion, absolutely. So as of the 1st of February 2020, World Health Organization, they revised their findings, and the transmission from asymptomatic cases is likely not a major driver of transmission, they thought. However,
epidemiological modeling, it is called.
Epidemiological models of the beginning of the outbreak in China suggested that the pre-symptomatic shedding may be typical among documented infections, and that subclinical infections may have been the source of majority of infections. That may explain how out of 217 patients on board a cruise liner that docked in Montevideo, only 24 of 128 who tested positive for viral RNA showed symptoms. Similarly, a study of 94 patients hospitalized in January and February February 2020 estimated patients shed the greatest amount of virus 2 to 3 days before symptoms appear, and that substantial proportion of the transmission probably occurred before the symptoms in the said patients. There is some evidence of human to animal transmission, for instance, of CoV-2, including examples in big cats in zoos, basically. So when people initially were visiting zoos, some cats in, for instance, United States and in Asia, these are big cats that are confined in zoos. They also develop symptoms.
So this is reverse infection now. I feel sorry for those poor cats in those zoos. But no, it's an interesting point that humans can also spread to other animals
back
as
to
well.
Animals, yes.
Arif, I just want to just cover a little bit more about the background and origins. We mentioned obviously this had been picked up in Wuhan city in China as well. But just take us through some of the questions around the seafood market and some of the questions associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, many of the first individuals found to be infected by the virus, they were workers at the Hunan seafood market. So it's been suggested that the strain may have originated from the market. This is, not proven. So there's other research that indicates that visitors may have introduced the virus to the market, which then facilitated rapid expansion of the infections. A network analysis of 160 early coronavirus genome sample from December 19 to February 20 revealed that the virus type most closely related to the bat coronavirus, and that was most abundant in Guangdong in China, and they designated this type A. The predominant type among samples from Wuhan, B, is more distantly related to the bat coronavirus than the ancestral type A. So again, we're focusing here a lot about bats, and bats are initially considered to be the most likely natural reservoir of SARS-CoV-2, which means that they harbour the virus for long periods of time with no pathogenic effects. Regarding the animal source of infection into humans, the differences between the bat coronavirus sampled at the time and SARS-CoV-2 suggest that humans were infected via an intermediate host. But I think that is still unclear. We don't know who that intermediate host may be. There are theories, but no clear-cut idea as to who that might be.
So this is where now there's a big divergence between what scientists say and are doing and what politicians are saying and doing. And clearly, from a geostrategic point of view and geopolitical point of view, there's a lot of finger pointing going on. But really, the science will hopefully help us solve this. A lot of just briefly touching on the epidemiology, Amjad, if you can just explain and shed some more light on the virus.
Not just that, just before we go to epidemiology, scientists have found, for instance, that mutation in these patients, the virus has mutated, and now there are 33 strains of these virus that are now being found in some of those people that were in China. So basically, people who want to develop the vaccine, that's another topic, but we need to take that into account as well. So that is part of, but however, based on the low variability exhibited among known SARS-CoV-2 genomic sequences, the strain is thought to have been detected by health authorities within the weeks of its emergence among the human population in the late 2019. The earliest case of infection.
That was quite an amazing achievement in how quickly they were able to sort out the genome, etc. And I know the editor of The Lancet has often been an outspoken critic of political figures really mishandling some of this. But from a scientific point of view, in both, one, the way the vaccine development is progressing, and also in terms of identifying, that was very, very good. But I just quickly want to jump on to, because we covered really the origins in Wuhan, etc. But the numbers at the moment are alarming, aren't they? Just as of 28th of August, I think it was, over 188 countries have reported it, with a total of 24.5 million infections. And the numbers just seem to be going up and up, I think.
Yes, I think it's very likely, and I think this is admitted by everybody, that these are underreported because there will be probably lots of infections that will never be identified. So at a very minimum, it's 25 million people that have become infected by this, probably 3, 4, 5 times as many people in reality that have become infected.
And again, it's quite interesting to see when you look at the breakdown of the number. The US still has the highest number of people who have died. Brazil's doing terrible as well with 3.7 million. India is not that far behind, 3.4 million. And, regardless whether we get the vaccine, the toll is going to be really quite awful. I think we're probably coming towards the end of the program, and it would be good to just give some broad advice, Amjad, to our listeners about what the government is trying to do and what is best practice. Do you want to just quickly talk us through?
Sure,
only got about 2 minutes
absolutely,
left.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. Of course, it's a horrible virus, and potentially now underreporting, despite the fact that over 25 million infections. But let's not forget the 16 million have also, recovered from as well. Yeah. So it's not all doom and gloom, and there is a hope in for this as well for all of us, I hope. And of course, as with any pandemic, it's very important for our listeners to follow government advice, and there is website, for instance, on COVID-19 and social distancing. So World Wide Web, www.gov.uk/coronavirus. And obviously, if you have symptoms or you fear that you may have picked up an infection, best thing to go is go on to World Wide Web, www.nhs.uk/coronavirus. And it's very important that you listen and you follow local government advice.
I think the best advice is about social distancing and trying to follow government advice on using masks. And really, if you feel you're infected, stay home. We're coming now to the last minute or so. So I wanted to thank Amjad and Arif for their excellent contributions in trying to understand COVID-19 and looking at the history of the pandemics. We hope listeners have enjoyed this program as well. In the first program, say you sort of saw the broad aspects of history of viruses, and in this one we focus specifically on COVID-19. Please do go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk and listen to the many other great programs we've done on living history as well. Do give us your feedback at VI Living History on Twitter, and if you have got any ideas or you want us to do any specific programs, we will do that. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this program. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum. Goodbye.